All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We try to focus in on obscure but powerful theories and discoveries, ways of thinking, and in this case, ways of decoding the Bible, in particular the New Testament of the Bible. And this is Bible Decode number 272. We've been exploring a lot about the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the Romans wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews, and they created the idea of Jesus, or maybe borrowed him from other scriptures. They created the story in its particulars, and it is part of a code or a series of riddles that you need another book to unlock, which is War of the Jews by Josephus, who was a member of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. Even though he was originally Jewish and fought on the losing side in the war between the Romans and the Jews, he surrendered to General Vespasian of the Romans and predicted that he would, then he defected and predicted he would one day become emperor. And when Vespasian did become emperor, he pardoned Josephus, brought him to Rome, made him one of the court historians, set him up at a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and adopted him as a member of his family, the newly found Flavian dynasty of Caesars. And as a result of all the zealousness and militaristic, fervor of the Jews, the Romans had a strong motive to try to domesticate them or to tame the Jews. Ever since they had become the custodians of the Jews via colonization or conquering in 63 BC. And 130 years later, it was still the same case that the Jews were a big pain in the side of the Romans, more so than any other group of people that they governed in their whole empire. And so they took advantage of the fact that they knew that the Jews were waiting on a Messiah, and so instead they proposed a Messiah who was not a military commander there to overthrow the Romans, like the Jews were waiting for, but instead a Prince of Peace, and one who believes in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, meaning paying your taxes, to walk an extra mile with the heavy soldier's pack, which was, part of the Roman law, that they could make a Jew carry their backpack for a mile, Roman soldier, and turning the other cheek to oppression. While at the same time, Jesus was also overturning the tables of the money changers who were Jews outside the Jewish temple, or at the outer court of the Jewish temple, disrupting the commerce of the Jewish merchants who were selling small animals for the sacrifice for the Jewish ritual of either Passover or whatever animal sacrifice we're talking about. So Jesus is taking aim at the Jewish traditions and the Jewish culture, but being very deferential to the Romans. Jesus told his Jewish disciples to abandon their families to follow him. Jesus also, even when he was 12 years old, he abandoned his own family. When they went to Jerusalem for Passover, his parents couldn't find him for like 3 days. he basically ran away, and he's over there preaching in the temple, not at all concerned about reuniting with his parents. So that's all in there because that is what the Romans would want in there as part of their psychological operation. And then as you move further on in the Bible, in the New Testament, Paul is even more deferential to the Romans and more, castigating of the Jews in the Pauline material. Just as if the Romans would have done it. But the evidence goes much further when you open up your copy of Josephus's War of the Jews. In that work, the parallels between Josephus and the Gospels are breathtaking. Michael Menescot's, in his new book, Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. And he graphed all of the parallels on a chart, taking a tip that he got from the end of Luke 9 and beginning of Luke 10, and he plotted a point for every parallel. And the 250 plus plotted points form 5 almost perfect, perfectly spaced, perfectly sized letters in Latin, the language of the emerging language of the Caesars, who also spoke Greek, which is the language of the Gospels and the language of Josephus. Not Aramaic, not Hebrew, which is what would have been spoken in Judea, had the scriptures come from there, but they didn't. They came from Rome. And, I hate to be the bearer of bad news like that, but it is actually good news because it's liberating. I'm like the older kid on the block who, when you're a young kid and you're maybe it's your older brother or your older sister, or if you're like me, an only child, then maybe the older kid down the street who you hated and caused you to cry when they burst your bubble and they told you that Santa Claus wasn't real. And you cried and you screamed and you hated this person and you avoided them. But eventually you came around to recognizing that my life is going to probably be just fine not believing in Santa Claus. Well, the amount of evidence for the existence of Jesus is slightly less than the amount of evidence for the existence of Santa Claus. Because at least with Santa Claus, on the night of December 24th, the weatherman tells you that he saw, that his radar detected Santa's sleigh leaving the North Pole. And so there's at least one kind of like authoritative source there for the existence of Santa Claus. There's nothing for the existence of Jesus. All of the corroborating evidence for the existence of Jesus is Roman. It is all coming from Roman royal sources, which are part of the psychological operation. Joseph Atwill discovered in his book Caesar's Messiah, discovered the fact that the ministry of Jesus, as laid out in the book of Luke, is nothing but a replica of the military campaign of General Titus of the Romans, according to War of the Jews by Josephus. What this shows is that, and then the life of Josephus, because he's a player in his history. He writes his history, but he's also one of the generals for the Jews in the history. And so he's part of the story. And his life story that he gives in War of the Jews is nothing but a replica of the life of Jesus. And so, the Bible is parodying or paralleling War of the Jews, Jesus to Titus. But then War of the Jews is paralleling the Gospels right back, Josephus to Jesus. So it's a mutual borrowing or a mutual paralleling, meaning that they were written by the same source, Josephus, or whoever Josephus was, regardless of who he was, it was coming from Rome. Josephus lived at Rome. His documents were enthusiastically endorsed by Emperor Titus. There's a ton of other evidence as well, but for today we're looking at as a book that is just kind of tangential to the Roman origins hypothesis, but is significant, I think, in helping us to decode, in particular, the book of Luke. We're going to be going through the book of Luke word by word, coming up in a few weeks, and we're going to be throwing the kitchen sink at the book of Luke, not just the decodes from like Michael Menescatz or Joseph Atwill, but there's a lot of astrological material, a lot of John Allegro stuff. There's a lot of Barbara Thiering stuff on coming from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's kind of where we are here. Is we're looking at a book from Robert Eisenman, who is one of the leading scholars of Dead Sea Scrolls stuff. He is one of the spearheaders of actually getting the Dead Sea Scrolls into the public consciousness, because when they were discovered in the late 40s and the early 1950s in a series of caves near Qumran, near Jerusalem, they were given, the custody of them was given to these Dominican priests who did nothing to translate them or to disseminate them to the public for almost 40 years, because they must have said something that they didn't like. And so that's how religion works. If you see something that you don't like, then you suppress it. Has absolutely nothing to do with the truth. Exactly as much to do with the truth as science has to do with the truth. And, it all has to do with the egos of the people and the comfort level of the people that are in the vested positions of vested interest. And they have shown time and time again throughout history that they don't have the, honesty or the dedication to truth to admit it when they are busted and when they got it wrong. That's only a rare scholar who does that. And so these Dominican priests kicked the can down the road for over 40 years before Eisenman and others kind of forced the material out there, at least photographs of it. And so he's an expert on Dead Sea Scrolls, but he's also firmly grounded in New Testament and a lot of the Apocrypha, the Pseudo-Clementine material, this book of Afranius, and pretty much anything that was written back in the first century. And that's part of the dispute of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is when were they actually written. Eisenman contends that they were written in the first century AD, and they have very clear relevance to the events that go on in the New Testament. These Dominican priests believed that this stuff was written way back in the 2nd century BC. So, that's the start, is to demonstrate at least for Eisenman, that these things are actually totally relevant to the events written in the Gospels. But then when you throw in the Roman origins hypothesis, which Eisenman didn't know about, at least at the time of this writing, that's thrown out the window because the events of the Gospels are fiction. It is even possible that the Dead Sea Scrolls may have been part of the source material for this may be where Josephus got his ideas for the story of Jesus. Anyway, we are reading a book that's called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. And we're in chapter 2, which is going over this idea about Zadok, the Zadok priesthood, the high priest, going back to the days of David and Solomon, and kind of how that language is used in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's Eisenman, kind of like a lot of the other authors that have done this work in terms of the Roman origins hypothesis. He does really detective work. A snippet here, a thing there, a citation here, and you kind of have to piece it together because the evidence in many cases is very sparse. Even then, even when you are considering Josephus to be a credible source and the Gospels considered to be a credible source, when you have the Roman origins hypothesis, neither of them are credible, and this Dead Sea Scrolls are really filling in a vacuum of, we don't know what the hell was going on in the first century, because our two major works are no longer valid. Now, whether the Dead Sea Scrolls are valid, I think it's much more likely because they're written in Hebrew and Aramaic, mostly Hebrew. I think just a couple of them are written in Greek. There's a lot of copies of the old Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament, but then there's a lot of sectarian material that is specific to this group of monks, more or less ascetic, pilgrims, whatever, living there at Qumran, who, lived a very simple, celibate life. And but then when they were invaded by the Romans, they stashed all of their material in these caves, where they sat for almost 1900 years before being discovered. Okay, let's start right here. It is significant that one of the original demands at the time of the first uprising in 4 BC, inspired, according to Josephus, by, quote, the Zealots, was to appoint, according to the law, a high priest of more perfect purity. For their part, it was the messianically inspired, zealous young priests who, by stopping sacrifice on behalf of the Romans, gave the signal for the start of the uprising in 66 AD. And that is the beginning of the War of the Jews that Josephus is documenting in his 7-volume book. And that's the same war that Vespasian and Titus were the generals until Titus took over for Vespasian when Vespasian became the emperor in 69 AD. Commentators who cannot make a determination as to whether the Dead Sea Scrolls sect was anti-Herodian or pro-Herodian, that means of the family of the Herods, the puppet rulers of Judea under the control of the Romans. Pro-Hyrcanus or pro-Aristobulus, and consequently are unable, for instance, to make any sense out of the destruction of the community in the 40s or 30s BC by fire, and are equally unable to understand any of the considerations delineated above, or rather simply do not wish to preferring to take a position on the relatively safer and less controversial questions of paleography and archaeology. And again, paleography, or however you pronounce it, it's palaeography. It's not paleography. I don't know. Eisenman writes it that way. I've seen it Palaeo, which is the study of scripts, like cursive writing. And over the decades, the kind of style of penmanship changes, and they're attempting to date these scripts using that, which seems like it's quite vague. You can't really pin somebody down to a really tight date, precise date. Okay, we are in the third chapter now. Chapter 3, Ecclesiasticus and Priestly Legitimacy. The all-important Hebrew text of Ecclesiasticus, or Ben Sirah as it is often denoted, found at 3 locations over the last century, in the Cairo Geniza, which also included the Damascus document from the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think that was like 1890s, 1896. Qumran, that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and Masada, which is the fortress down south, which was the last place that held out for the Jews when they were conquered by, or when they were defeated by the Romans in 73 AD. So they were discovered, this text was discovered in those 3 locations, is crucial to the matter of the Zadokite or Sadducean priestly claims, and one of the keys to unraveling the Second Temple sectarian puzzle. The Sadducean or scribal character of the text has generally been recognized. What was not so plain was its sectarian character, nor how the key material in chapters 50 and 51, missing from the Septuagint and the Vulgate version, that's both the Greek and the Latin versions, so only in the Hebrew version, was used to legitimize priestly claims by all the sects heir to the legacy, spiritual or otherwise, of the saintly Simeon the Zadok. These include, as we shall see, the Maccabees, Zealots, Zadokites, and probably even the Christians, namely all the groups outside of the Pharisaic/Herodian establishment of 40 BC onward. The Pharisees also used Simeon, but not to establish priestly legitimacy, rather as a link in the transmission of right-guided tradition. I have left both Essenes and Sadducees off the list. It is, strictly speaking, imprecise to refer to the Zadokites at Qumran as Essenes, which the majority of scholars in the field tend to do for polemical reasons of their own. Now, when you recognize the Roman origins hypothesis, the concept of the Essenes becomes difficult, because the only people who have ever corroborated the existence of the Essenes were also good buddies of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, which includes, I think, Philo and Pliny the Elder and Josephus. I might be wrong about Pliny. Some Roman. So there isn't any real evidence for the existence of the Essenes either. Now, the Essenes were supposed to be this another pious Jewish sect that Jesus belonged to originally. Many, especially Gnostic Christians believed that Jesus was one of the Essenes, which the majority of scholars in the field tend to do for polemical reasons of their own. The sectaries at Qumran might be Essenes, but the case is by no means proven. Nor is it clear how the Essenes saw the problem of priestly succession, nor how they would then differ from Hasidians, zealots, partisans of Judas Maccabee, or even his enemies. One is on safer ground to use the sectaries' own terminology, whether sons of Zadok, Abianim, Zadikim, or Hasidim, or some other, all terms found generously sprinkled throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls literature and meaningful in the light of sectarian history in Palestine. Note that the Dead Sea Scrolls do not mention Essenes, although they do mention Hasidim. So that's a pretty similar word, but not quite. So I think, and Sadducees isn't that far off either. So, but, I think Eisenman is making a correct assessment here that you can't call them Essenes because they didn't call themselves that. For their part, the so-called Sadducees are dominated by the Pharisees in their post-Herodian embodiment, as Josephus tells us in no uncertain terms. They are in no way Zadokite if Qumran is typical of what we mean by Zadokite. We have already noted that their legal and spiritual legitimacy was called into question by those Josephus calls desirous of innovation as early as 4 BC. Quite properly, as it were, since these new model Sadducees are thoroughly compromised by their Roman/Herodian connections. So I think when Josephus uses the term innovation, he's usually talking about like making war upon. Let us attempt a reconstruction following priestly lines of legitimacy, but without adhering to the interpretation of Zadokite as implying only or even primarily genealogical descent. It is generally accepted that Simeon the Zadok, whether the early one of Josephus and imprecise rabbinic speculation or the latter one of Ecclesiasticus, is a true son of Zadok, meaning a lineal descendant of the Davidic Solomonic high priest. But there is nowhere any proof of this. This is one of the implicit assumptions of Qumran scholarship, and it should be found wanting. Most of the edifice so artfully constructed upon it becomes extremely fragile. There is no proof that Ezra is a Zadokite priest or Ezekiel who first employs the term in a significant way, or even Elijah for that matter. It is true that someone wants us to think that Ezra is a Zadokite priest and he is supplied with a good Zadokite genealogy, but on closer inspection, one finds that he is given the exact same genealogy as Jesus ben Jehozadak 100 years earlier, the first high priest after the return from captivity. Even this genealogy has gaps in it and contradicts what is known about priestly succession in other parts of the Bible. For Bowman, all such genealogies are artificial, since very little survived the Babylonian destruction. Biblical ploys, old or new, on matters of genealogy are, in any event, something to be handled with circumspection. More importantly, what has never been remarked is that the claim being put forward on behalf of Ezra is not the normal Zadokite one at all, but rather what we have been calling the zealot. Indeed, Ezra is the zealous priest par excellence, showing incontrovertible zeal for the law, even to the extent of demanding the divorce of alien, including Samaritan, wives, a typical Phineas-style procedure. No doubt Ezra would have preferred a harsher penalty than excommunication had the Yehud of his day not simply been autonomous, and had he had the powers to impose the death penalty. In any case, his powers seem to have reached right into the Zadokite high priestly household itself. Not only does he occupy its temple chambers, but he banishes one of its heirs, Sanballat's son-in-law, which seems to be the birth moment of Samaritan Zadokite claims. Okay, it doesn't really look like there's any stopping points along the way here, so we'll stop right here. And next we'll be talking about a little bit about the Maccabees, which were the dynasty of Jewish kings in the late late second and early first century, or really, half of the second and half of the first century, or even more. But we'll get into that tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in today, and come back tomorrow to learn more about different interpretations of who these various people are and what kind of language they're using to describe this, and how these Dead Sea Scroll people thought, and a lot of other stuff. Please like, share, subscribe, and have a great